Hi, my name is Lydia Stepanek. I'm a software engineer at MongoDB, and I'm here with my colleagues Derek Lowry and Janet Golden, who are both members of the MongoDB Green Team with me, to talk to you about building a green initiative. This is a statistic about one of my favorite Netflix shows, The Queen's Gambit, which 62 million people watched in the first few months. And as all 62 million people watched it, or if you take all the cumulative views, that used as much of one episode that used as much energy as 1,290 UK houses do in a year. And that's a lot of energy. When I first realized this statistic, I was shocked because I think of my TV as being the only electricity usage that is consumed when I'm streaming video on Netflix. But that's not the case. There's a lot of electricity being used, it turns out, to store the video on a computer, on a server somewhere, and to transmit that video data across the internet. So you may be wondering, how does the internet use so much energy? Or why does that take so much energy? Here's a diagram that explains it. That's from the Washington Post. And this diagram contains things like routers and modems and internet service providers. Don't worry about any of that. The thing I want you to notice in this diagram is the white cubes that represent servers. And when you think of a server, you can think of it as a computer that's hooked up to the internet. And servers, like computers, use a lot of electricity or use a fair amount of electricity. And when you watch a video on Netflix, that video is stored somewhere on a computer that needs to be running. So that storage takes electricity. And then that video also needs to be transferred from computer to computer to computer to wherever you are. And that transfer of data takes a lot of electricity. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes when we're using the internet and using our phones or using our TVs that we're not necessarily aware of. This is not a technical talk, and this is not a talk about statistics. This is a talk about culture. It's about responsibility. It's about MongoDB. It's about the MongoDB Green Team. And you may be wondering, what do those things all have to do with each other? And that's what this talk is going to be about today. First, it's important to talk about climate change. Now, this graph is published in many places, and the numbers vary depending on the study, but most scientists agree that it shows kind of the best case scenario for if we rapidly decarbonize our economy, which is the lower green line, then we can keep temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 and avert a lot of the disasters associated with climate change. And if we continue with business as usual, which is the top gray line, then temperature rises across the world could reach 4 degrees Celsius, and there could be a lot of catastrophic effects. And that's where data comes into this. You may have heard the term before, data is the new oil. And this was coined in an Economist article in 2017, talking about how data had replaced oil as the most precious commodity in the world. Oil, the companies that, like oil and gas companies, used to be the most valued companies in the world. If you looked at a list of the top companies, it would have been Exxon and Chevron and companies like that. But nowadays, it's data companies like Amazon, Apple, Google. And just like oil is a precious resource, data is a precious resource too. There are a lot of similarities between oil and data. On the left, I show in the upper left is an icon representing airline travel. And oil allows us to do things in our lives that make life a lot better, like being able to fly to visit relatives or travel by car. But there are downsides to this because burning oil releases CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. The same way with data. Data allows us to store and track our medical records and look at our checkout history on our favorite websites, and makes us able to use a lot of goods and services that make our lives a lot better. But as we've seen, using data and transferring data requires things like data centers, and depending on which energy grids these data centers are hooked up to, can have different effects on the number of greenhouse gases that are being emitted as part of our data usage, which is why it's important to be aware of these things. Also, data usage isn't going anywhere. It's only increasing. So in the past 30, this is a diagram of the past 30 years of the amount of data transferred over the internet. In 1987, there were only 2 terabytes of data being transferred, which is crazy when you think about it, because that's just not a lot of data by today's standards. But that's because there were only a few supercomputers at certain universities that were even hooked up to the internet. And it was only in 1989 that the internet was actually commercialized. But nowadays, not only businesses, not only universities, but individuals are all using the internet. And now the world collectively is transferring 1.1 zettabytes of data over the internet as of 2017. And you may be wondering, well, how big did this number get in 2020? Because we've all been reading about how Zoom usage went up a lot in 2020 and Netflix usage went up. And I was curious too. So I looked at a study that predicted what data usage would be in 2020. And experts were predicting it would be more than 2 zettabytes. And it turned out that we actually used more than 3 zettabytes of data in 2020. And as for the future, experts predict that we will be using 4.8 zettabytes of data on the internet by 2022. So this circle on the right is only going to get 4 times bigger by 2022. So what can we do? We work for a data company. So how can we educate ourselves and how can we have an impact so that we're making sure that the data industry is more responsible perhaps than industries like the oil industry? That brings us to the MongoDB Green Team. So the MongoDB Green Team was founded April 22nd, Earth Day, 2020. We've had 250 people plus join, and we've held more than 20 events across all our offices. We've also calculated our 2019 and 2020 carbon footprint, and that's something Jana and Derek are going to be talking about soon. So the MongoDB Green Team, when thinking about the question, what can we do, took a 2-pronged approach. The first approach was individual education. So, like, for example, me, did I know how much electricity usage is used for running a server, or that any of the things I've been telling you about? No, I only knew what I read occasionally in the newspaper. So the individual education part was about us hosting events, bringing in experts, holding workshops, and learning a lot to increase our own education on an individual level. And then the second goal of the MongoDB Green Team is to encourage business action by working with MongoDB leadership to run business operations more sustainably. And that brings us to the individual education part, which I'll be handing over to my colleague, Jana.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lydia. So as Lydia mentioned, individual education and promoting climate literacy among ourselves and our networks is one of the goals of the MongoDB Green Team. So we've hosted a number of events and talks and workshops all over the world, but I'll just talk about a few of them today. So I know that many of you don't live in New York City, but you might be aware that MongoDB is headquartered in New York. So we brought in Dan Hubert from the New York City Independent Budget Office to come to speak to us about the city's recycling system. And he talked to us about a number of aspects of the system, including what can actually be recycled. And we learned that it is actually okay to recycle that lightly greasy pizza box, which is pretty exciting news because we eat a lot of pizza here. But joking aside, we also spoke about the global commodity market for recyclable materials. So a number of countries like the United States, Germany, and Japan actually export some of their recyclables to other countries like Malaysia and Vietnam. So this is a chart of slightly outdated numbers for market prices for some of those materials. And you can see that something like aluminum cans are actually pretty valuable. Whereas if you look at mixed glass, the city government has to pay someone to take that off their hands. So this was a really great call to action for us. When we're in the store to think about, am I buying this in its aluminum can form, or am I buying this in its glass bottle form? As well as when I go to recycle my materials to make sure that I'm doing a really good job separating them. We also hosted Simone Ahiaku, who is a climate activist from the UK, and she gave a workshop on climate justice and climate racism. So she spoke to us about the intersection of race and climate change. and how colonialism still feeds into current environmental degradation today. So wealthier, more powerful nations have and continue to exploit resources from other nations, often leading to economic progression or higher standards of living for their own citizens, but leaving environmental damage in their wake. And typically, those most affected by climate change are Black and Indigenous people of color who are actually contributing the least to climate change. So we spoke about the need for climate justice, and Simone provided us with resources on how we can help to make these systemic changes so that we all share these burdens equally. And then the last initiative that I'll speak to you about today was a community-sourced plant-based cookbook. So why plant-based? I'm sure many of you have heard about the environmental impacts of the industrial meat industry. And you know that eating less meat can be a good option to lower your own carbon footprint. But we might not always know how to plan a meal around plants. And then why a cookbook? It's really great for community participation to engage your community and then to share that knowledge and that information with your own networks, your own families and friends. So, sharing meals and recipes is common among our networks, and sharing a plant-based recipe can be a really great conversation starter about, what kind of habits we can change in order to live a more sustainable life. So all of these initiatives actually had a lot of participation, which was really awesome to help get our momentum going, to start to tackle our bigger goal of working with the MongoDB leadership team to encourage business change. And so, before we started making any business changes, we really wanted to measure our carbon footprint and see, where is the smart places to be making these changes. And Derek and Lydia actually spent a lot of time trying to understand and learn about all of the frameworks and, how to report and how to measure on their own, and realized that it's actually super complicated, and it's best to get some experts to help you out. So MongoDB is partnered with Watershed. And Watershed is a company that's dedicated to helping other companies to measure their carbon footprints and identify areas where they can make changes to run their business more sustainably. So before we dive into looking at MongoDB's emissions and what we're planning to do about it, we really need to talk about the emission scopes. So emissions are divided into 3 scopes. So scope 1, you can see in the middle of this graph here in blue, refers to direct emissions from the reporting company. So this includes things like emissions from your company's delivery vehicles. And a company like MongoDB really doesn't have a ton of scope 1 emissions. Then scope 2 emissions, you can see it's that gray arrow on the left-hand side, refer to indirect emissions coming from purchased electricity. So this is something like, the emissions generated from the electricity used to power your office's HVAC systems. And then scope 3 emissions are really where the big numbers come in, and it's often the scope that a number of companies leave out. But it's actually super important. So you can see the scope 3s in purple here on the left and right-hand side of this image. And they cover upstream activities such as, business travel, but also the emissions from the vendor that MongoDB buys its in-office snacks from. And then it also includes downstream activities, so your products and product life cycles. So many of you have probably heard of Atlas. It's MongoDB's cloud-hosted database platform. And so the MongoDB's scope 3 emissions includes the emissions from those Atlas instances running in whatever data centers they're running in. So you can imagine that the numbers can get pretty up there. So, how do we actually calculate these emissions? This is a little bit simplified, but you take some business activity as your input, multiply it by some emissions factor, and come out with some number of tons of carbon. And I'll run through a couple of examples here. So, to figure out the emissions coming from car commuting to a given MongoDB office, we essentially need to calculate the total number of miles driven by employees to get to work, and then multiply that by the emissions per vehicle mile. So we provide Watershed with the number of employees that work in a certain office, and then they have data on, the average percentage of people that commute to work by car in that city, and how far that commute typically is, and what percentage of cars are gas versus electric. And we use all of those numbers to come out with that final number. And then to take a look at how we calculate this for cloud, we essentially look at the hours of usage by machine and instance type in a given region to come up with the total electricity used in that region. And then we multiply that by the emissions per kilowatt hour for that given region. So I'm sure some of us are aware that some data centers run on a greener electricity grid than others. So the emissions from instances running in those regions would be much lower than those running in regions that might be powered by coal. And so all of these are interesting levers that you can look at to see, where your emissions are coming from and where you might be able to make some changes. And I'll hand it over to Derek to talk to you all about what MongoDB's emissions look like and what we plan to do with them.
Thank you, Jana. Before I walk through MongoDB's emissions, I want to recap what we've said so far. Lydia has spoke about the role that the tech industry plays in the climate crisis, and then both Jana and Lydia have explained how MongoDB is contributing to the solution. The next step for us as a company was to self-reflect on our own carbon footprints. We calculated our carbon footprint for 2019 and 2020 in conjunction with our partners Watershed, and we found that we were emitting about 30,000 tons of carbon for each year. What does it mean to emit 30,000 tons of carbon? Well, it would take 1.3 million trees sequestering carbon in a given year to offset the impact of 30,000 tons of carbon. What does 1.3 million trees look like? It would be a forest the size of the city of Barcelona. So that's quite big in the grand scheme of things. And actually, there's not enough forest landmass available on our planet for companies to offset their emissions through planting trees. The interesting part of our carbon footprint exercise came when we took a deep dive into the data. Cloud is the growing part of our business through our cloud offering MongoDB Atlas, but it's also the side of the business that contributes most to our carbon footprint. This is because we include Scope 3 emissions, as Jana alluded to earlier. Another interesting element of the data is the high impact of the travel side of the business in 2019, as shown by the green box. This has obviously reduced significantly in 2020 due to the COVID crisis, but it did lead us as a company to reflect on our own travel habits, and we have made adjustments to that to reduce the impact of travel on our carbon footprint. As a growing business, we're obviously growing employee numbers and we're growing office space. This too has an impact on our carbon footprint, as highlighted by the yellow boxes in the bar graphs below. So how does our carbon footprint compare across the industry? There are lots of companies out there with climate strategies, but actually not a lot of those companies are very transparent in what they're doing about reaching their climate targets. We were able to compare our own data to companies like Microsoft, Salesforce, and Adobe on a per $1 million revenue basis in order to get comparable information. And again, the interesting part of that was the travel side of our business was up to 4 times larger when it came to the carbon footprint impact. What I'd like to do with this slide here is discuss a little bit the terminology that goes with the area of sustainability. You've probably all heard of the terms carbon neutral and net zero. But what does it mean to say that you're carbon neutral or net zero? With both of these strategies, you will always have your emissions from activities after doing whatever reduction strategies you can put in place. So there's always going to be emissions from activities. But with net zero, you pay to remove the equivalent CO2 from the atmosphere, as opposed to carbon neutral, where you pay others to avoid emitting a similar level of CO2. If you think about this from a forestry analogy point of view, carbon neutral is like paying a company not to cut down trees, whereas net zero is paying a company to plant new trees in order for additional CO2 to be removed from the atmosphere. I mentioned the reduction strategies earlier. So in general, the levers that tech companies use to reduce their emissions are shown here. They are adjusting your cloud setup. So that could mean moving to more sustainable cloud providers or running your cloud instances in less CO2 intense regions. You can purchase clean power. You can engage with suppliers to set reduction targets. And here you should really engage with your procurement team to assist, because there can be particularly effective impacts on the carbon footprint with large dollar spends such as office fit outs and so on. You can reduce your T&E policy. You can adjust your T&E policy in order to reduce business travel necessity. You can also help to reduce the car commuting among your employees by promoting alternative commuting methods. Again, I just want to reflect on where we are in this. We've spoke about the role that the data and the tech industry has to play in the climate crisis. We've also talked about how MongoDB has established our Green Team and the 2 work streams that we're focusing on there around education and then our own carbon footprint. And what I want to do next is talk about the benefits of doing all of this. There are the obvious macro benefits to society that Lydia alluded to earlier in her presentation as a result of keeping global temperatures to 1.5 degree increases by 2050. They are a reduction in severe weather conditions such as typhoons, extreme heat, and the impact that they have on often less advantaged communities through wildfires, destruction of homes, businesses, and so on. On a global level, there are benefits from reducing the speed of sea level rises. Whole nations such as Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean are under threat of submersion as a result of sea level rises. Keeping global temperatures to 1.5 degree increases by 2050 can help alleviate that threat. Air quality has deteriorated rapidly in our cities over the last few decades, and reducing CO2 emissions can help improve air quality in our cities to make them more enjoyable and healthier places to live. Our planet is warming faster now than at any time in the past 10,000 years. With these changes, species have had to adapt to new climate patterns such as variations in rainfall, longer, warmer summers, etc. Global warming is likely to be the greatest cause of species extinction this century, and the IPCC say that a 1.5 degree average rise in temperatures may put 20 to 30% of species at risk of extinction. If the planet warms by more than 2 degrees, most ecosystems will struggle. So, if all of those societal benefits weren't enough for us to do something about this crisis, there are also benefits for the business. We're going to talk about 4 of those benefits here today. They are employer brand, employee morale, customer demand, and financial benefits. On employer brand, employees are more interested in working for environmentally responsible companies now. A recent Fast Company survey suggested that 75% of millennials would take a pay cut in order to work for a more environmentally conscious company. Branding is extremely important when it comes to recruiting in the tech industry, and having a solid sustainability program in place can help give your company an upper hand when it comes to the war on talents. Connecting cross-functionally with like-minded people within your organization can have huge morale benefits, as well as fostering new relationships and connections. At the same time, employees just feel better about working on projects that they truly care about. I most likely would never have met people like Jana and Lydia were it not for our green team. And working with them has inspired me to continue to work for a company like MongoDB that is committed to making it matter when it comes to reducing our impact on the environment. Customers are demanding this. Customers are increasingly demanding products and services to be sourced more sustainably and with minimal impact on the environment. Not addressing our environmental impact will increasingly lead to our company and your company not being considered at our customers' procurement stage. And finally, we have the financial benefit. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock Wealth Capital Management. This is the largest wealth capital management company in the world. He writes a letter each year to the Fortune 500 CEOs, and in 2020, he claimed in his letter that for BlackRock, climate risk was investment risk. He went one step further in 2021 by suggesting the need for a tectonic shift towards net zero. If businesses are not addressing their environmental impact, they risk losing out on a whole cohort of investors that will simply not engage with them in the future. So what next? Well, if you're thinking about doing something or setting up something like this in your own firm, then we hope that we've inspired you to just go for it. Don't wait for someone else to do it. You are the one that can get the ball rolling on this and help your company to be part of the environmental revolution. Thank you for listening. We are sticking around now for a Q&A, so feel free to drop us any questions that you may have. If you're watching this on a recording, then feel free to reach out to Jana, Lydia, or myself by email. Our email addresses are listed on this slide, and we're happy to talk to you about the learnings that we've had through setting up the Green Team. So thank you for listening.